There's a farmhouse in eastern Pennsylvania that no one talks about anymore. The locals know the name, but they won't say it out loud. In 1879, two brothers lived there with a woman they called their wife. But she wasn't their wife. She was their mother, and what happened inside those walls didn't stay hidden forever. This is the story the town tried to bury. This is the story that still haunts the county records. This is the account of the Craven Brothers and the woman they refused to let go. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Craven family name appears in the Pennsylvania census records as early as 1843, but by 1879, only 3 of them remained. The father, Samuel Craven, had been dead for 6 years. The youngest daughter had married and moved west. What was left was a widow named Dorothea, age 51, and her 2 sons, Lee, 32, and Nathaniel, 29. They lived together on a failing wheat farm outside a town so small it doesn't appear on most modern maps. The neighbors said the brothers never left the property. They said Dorothea stopped coming to church after her husband died. They said the house smelled like something had gone wrong inside it, something that couldn't be washed out. At first, people assumed it was grief. Samuel Craven had been a cruel man, known for his temper and his drinking, and Dorothea had borne the worst of it. After his death, it seemed natural that the widow would retreat, natural that her sons would stay close to protect her. But then the rumors started. A traveling preacher knocked on their door one evening in 1877 and later told the town council he'd seen something that made him physically ill. He wouldn't say exactly what, only that the boys called their mother by a name a son should never use, only that she seemed afraid of them, only that when he asked to pray with the family, Illy Craven told him they had no need for God anymore. The preacher left and never came back. The town constable was notified, but he didn't investigate. In those days, what happened inside a man's home was his own business, even if that man wasn't quite right in the head, even if the house itself seemed to be rotting from the inside. The Craven farm became a place people avoided. Mothers told their children not to wander near the property line. Men who rode past it on horseback said they heard voices coming from the barn at night, voices that sounded like singing or praying, or something worse. In the spring of 1879, a local physician named Dr. Harold Pemberton was called to the Craven farm. He'd been summoned by a letter, unsigned, left at his office door in the middle of the night. The letter said only that a woman was suffering and needed help. Pemberton assumed it was Dorothea. He rode out to the property on a Tuesday morning, and what he found there would later become the centerpiece of a coroner's inquest that the county tried very hard to keep quiet. The house was in a state of decay that seemed impossible for only 6 years of neglect. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like old bed sheets, stained and torn. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. When Pemberton knocked, no one answered, but he could hear movement inside. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of something being dragged across a wooden floor. He called out, identified himself as a doctor, and after a long silence, the door opened. Illy Craven stood there, gaunt and barefoot, his clothes hanging off him like he'd lost 40 pounds. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse, almost childlike. He said his mother was upstairs. He said she'd been asking for a doctor. He said they'd been taking care of her the best they could. Pemberton followed him inside, and the smell hit him immediately. It wasn't just unwashed bodies or spoiled food. It was something deeper, something organic and wrong. The air was thick with it. The parlor was filled with strange objects, Bibles stacked in crooked towers, candles burned down to stumps, crude drawings pinned to the walls that looked like they'd been made by children, though the subject matter was anything but childlike. Pemberton would later describe them as religious in nature, but distorted, as though someone had tried to recreate scripture from a fractured memory. Upstairs, in a small bedroom at the end of the hall, he found Dorothea Craven. She was lying in a bed that hadn't been changed in what looked like months. Her hair was long and matted. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. But it wasn't her physical condition that disturbed Pemberton most. It was the way she looked at him, blank, distant, as though she wasn't fully present in her own body. When he asked her how she was feeling, she didn't answer. She only turned her head toward the door, where both of her sons now stood, watching. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said something that Pemberton would never forget. She said, "They won't let me leave." "Doctor." Pemberton examined Dorothea as best he could under the circumstances. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and showed signs of prolonged physical neglect. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite name in his initial report. Her wrists bore faint marks, circular and worn, as though she'd been restrained at some point. Her ankles showed similar scarring. When he asked the brothers about this, Nathaniel stepped forward and explained, in a calm and measured tone, that their mother sometimes tried to harm herself, that she'd been unwell since their father's death, that they'd had no choice but to keep her safe, even if it meant tying her down for her own protection. Pemberton didn't believe him, but he also didn't know what to do. The brothers were polite, cooperative even. They offered him tea. They asked if there was medicine he could provide. They stood too close when they spoke, their eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He told them he would need to return the following week to check on Dorothea's progress. They agreed, and as he left the house, he heard singing again, soft, melodic, coming from somewhere upstairs. It was Dorothea's voice, but the words were wrong. They weren't from any hymn he recognized. When Pemberton returned to town, he went directly to the constable. He told him everything: the condition of the house, the marks on Dorothea's body, the strange behavior of the sons, the feeling that something deeply unnatural was happening on that farm. The constable listened, nodded, and then asked a question that would haunt Pemberton for the rest of his life. He asked, "Did the woman say she wanted to leave?" Pemberton paused. Technically, she hadn't. She'd said, "They won't let me leave," but she hadn't explicitly asked for help, and in 1879 that distinction mattered. Without a direct accusation, without proof of a crime, there was nothing the law could do. The constable told Pemberton to keep an eye on the situation and report back if anything changed, but something had already changed. 4 days after Pemberton's visit, a fire broke out at the Craven farm. It started in the barn and spread quickly, consuming the structure in less than an hour. The neighbors saw the smoke and came running, but by the time they arrived, the barn was gone. The house, miraculously, was untouched. Ellie and Nathaniel Craven stood in the yard watching the flames die down, their faces expressionless. When asked what happened, Ellie said it was an accident. A lantern had been knocked over, no one was hurt. And when someone asked where their mother was, Nathaniel smiled, a thin, cold smile, and said she was resting. The fire should have been the end of it. The town should have intervened, but instead, something stranger happened. The Craven brothers became more visible. They started coming into town again, appearing at the general store, attending Sunday service for the first time in years. They were clean, shaven, neatly dressed, and spoke with a kind of eerie cheerfulness that unsettled everyone who encountered them. When people asked about Dorothea, they said she was doing much better, that she was recovering, that she sent her regards, but no one ever saw her, not at church, not at the market, not anywhere. Doctor. Pemberton returned to the farm twice more over the following months. Each time, the brothers met him at the door and told him their mother was sleeping, or praying, or simply not well enough for visitors. They were never rude. They never refused him outright. They simply made it impossible for him to see her alone. On his third visit, in late summer of 1879, Pemberton insisted. He told them he had a legal obligation to examine his patient. Illy looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back, and then, without a word, they stepped aside and let him in. Dorothea was in the same upstairs bedroom, but she looked different. Her hair had been washed and braided. She wore a clean dress, white and simple, almost ceremonial. The room had been scrubbed spotless. There were fresh flowers on the windowsill. She sat in a chair by the bed, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. When Pemberton entered, she didn't acknowledge him. He knelt beside her, checked her pulse, examined her eyes. Physically, she seemed stable, but when he spoke to her, asked her simple questions. Her name, the date, how she was feeling. She didn't respond. Not at first. And then, slowly, she turned her head toward him, and in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, she said, "I am their mother. I am their wife. I am what they need me to be." Pemberton felt his blood run cold. He asked her what she meant. She didn't answer. She just smiled, a vacant, hollow smile, and turned her gaze back to the wall. Behind him, in the doorway, the brothers stood shoulder to shoulder, watching. Nathaniel spoke first. He said their mother had finally found peace, that she understood now, that they were a family again, the way God intended. Pemberton wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but something in their eyes stopped him. He left the house that day and never went back. He filed a report with the county detailing his concerns, but it was buried in a drawer and forgotten. The truth didn't come out until October of 1879, and it came from the most unlikely source. A young woman named Clara Dietrich, who worked as a seamstress in town, had grown up on the property adjacent to the Craven farm. She'd known the family since childhood, had even played with Illy and Nathaniel when they were boys. But after Samuel Craven's death, she'd been forbidden by her own parents from going near the property. Still, Clara was curious, and one evening, while walking along the edge of her family's land, she heard something that stopped her cold. It was a woman's voice, singing, but it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from beneath it. Clara crept closer, staying low in the tall grass, and followed the sound to the back of the Craven home. There, half hidden by overgrown weeds, was a cellar door she'd never noticed before. It was padlocked from the outside. The singing was coming from below, soft, rhythmic, almost lullaby-like. Clara pressed her ear to the wood and listened. The voice was Dorothea's, but the words she sang made no sense. They were fragments, repeated over and over. 2 sons, 1 womb, 2 husbands, 1 tomb. What was given cannot leave. What was made must not grieve. Clara ran. She told her father, who initially dismissed it as her imagination, but Clara insisted, and eventually her father went to the constable. This time, the constable couldn't ignore it. He gathered 2 other men from town, and together they rode out to the Craven farm just after dawn. The brothers were not expecting them. When the constable demanded to see Dorothea, Illy tried to close the door, but the constable forced his way inside. Nathaniel stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the way, insisting their mother was not to be disturbed. The constable pushed past him. The bedroom was empty. They found her in the cellar. The door had been unlocked recently, it seemed. But Dorothea was still down there, sitting on a bare mattress in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes wide and glassy. The walls around her were covered in writing. Not words, exactly, but symbols, shapes, something that resembled language but wasn't. The constable would later say it looked like someone had been trying to invent a new scripture. Dorothea didn't resist when they brought her up. She didn't speak. She moved like a sleepwalker, guided by hands that were no longer her own. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Dorothea Craven was taken from the farm that morning and placed in the care of a local minister and his wife, while the authorities tried to determine what exactly had happened to her. She barely spoke for the first 3 days. She ate only when forced. She stared at walls for hours, rocking gently back and forth, humming melodies no one recognized. The minister's wife tried to comfort her, tried to ask gentle questions, but Dorothea would only repeat the same phrases she'd been singing in the cellar. 2 sons, 1 womb, 2 husbands, 1 tomb. When asked directly if her sons had harmed her, she looked confused, as though the question itself made no sense. She said they loved her, she said they needed her, she said she had failed them when their father died, and they had shown her how to be whole again. The brothers were arrested and held in the county jail. At first, they refused to speak to anyone. They sat in their cell, side by side, whispering to each other in voices too low for the guards to hear. When the prosecutor finally questioned them separately, their stories were identical, rehearsed, almost scripted. They said their mother had suffered a collapse after their father's death, that she'd become convinced she was going to die alone and unloved, that she'd begged them not to leave her. They said everything they'd done had been to keep her safe, to keep the family together. They admitted to keeping her in the cellar, but only, they claimed, because she'd asked them to. Because she said the darkness helped her think, because she wanted to be close to the earth where her husband was buried. The prosecutor didn't believe them, neither did the judge, but the case was complicated by one undeniable fact. Dorothea herself refused to testify against her sons. When brought before the court, she sat silent, her hands folded, her expression blank. When asked if she'd been held against her will, she said no. When asked if her sons had forced her into the cellar, she said no. When asked if they'd ever called her their wife, she paused for a long time, and then, in a voice that made everyone in the courtroom go still, she said, "I have always belonged to them, even before they were born." The judge pressed her. He asked what she meant. She didn't clarify. She simply repeated it, word for word, like a prayer she'd memorized. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The defense attorney seized on her testimony, arguing that whatever had happened on the Craven farm was a private family matter, a product of shared grief and isolation, not criminal intent. The prosecution argued that Dorothea had clearly been psychologically broken, that her testimony was the result of prolonged manipulation and abuse. But without a clear victim willing to accuse her abusers, the case began to fall apart. In November of 1879, after 3 weeks of deliberation, the judge made his ruling. Illy and Nathaniel Craven were found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and were sentenced to 2 years each in the county workhouse. It was a lenient sentence, even by the standards of the time, and it sent a message: what happens inside a family stays inside a family. Section 7, the brothers served their sentences without incident. They were model prisoners, quiet and obedient, and were released in the fall of 1881. By then, Dorothea had been moved to a private asylum in Philadelphia, paid for by a distant cousin who wanted nothing to do with the scandal. The doctors there described her as docile but unreachable, lost somewhere inside herself. She would sit by the window for hours, tracing patterns on the glass with her fingertip, the same symbols that had covered the cellar walls. She died in 1884 at the age of 56. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the attending physician noted in his private journal that she'd simply stopped eating, stopped drinking, stopped trying. He wrote that in her final days she kept asking for her sons, that she said she needed to go home, that she said they were waiting for her. Illy and Nathaniel Craven left Pennsylvania immediately after their release. They traveled west, and the historical record loses them somewhere in the territories. Some say they changed their names. Others say they died on the road, forgotten and alone. But there are stories, unverified and impossible to confirm, that suggest otherwise. In 1887, A woman in Kansas reported two brothers living on an isolated homestead who kept their elderly mother locked in a root cellar. In 1892, a similar account emerged from Nebraska. The details were always slightly different, but the pattern was the same. Two men, unmarried, living with a woman they claimed was their mother, but who they treated like something else entirely. The Craven farm itself stood empty for decades. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live there. Children from the surrounding area would dare each other to approach the house at night, and those who did reported hearing voices from the cellar, even though the cellar had been filled in with dirt and sealed shut. In 1923, the house burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. The local fire marshal ruled it arson, but no one was ever charged. The land was eventually sold and divided, and today it's part of a suburban development. The people who live there don't know what once stood on that soil. They don't know about Dorothea or Illy or Nathaniel. They don't know about the cellar or the symbols or the woman who sang in the dark. But the court records still exist. The testimonies are still there, locked away in county archives that few people ever bother to search. Dr. Pemberton's reports, Clara Dietrich's account, the minister's notes on Dorothea's final years, they're all part of the historical record, fragments of a story the world tried to forget. What happened in that house in 1879 wasn't just abuse. It was something deeper, something that twisted the bonds of family into something unrecognizable. The Craven brothers didn't just imprison their mother, they tried to remake her into something she was never meant to be. And in doing so, they destroyed all three of them. The question that haunts the case isn't whether it happened. The evidence is clear. The question is why Dorothea let it happen, why she never asked for help. Why, even at the end, she defended them. Some historians believe she was simply broken by years of abuse, that her mind had fractured under the weight of what her sons had done to her. Others believe something darker, that in the isolation of that farm, in the years after Samuel Craven's death, a new kind of family was born, one that operated outside the boundaries of sanity, morality, or law. One that consumed all three of them from the inside out. The Craven case remains one of the most disturbing family crimes in American history, not because of its violence, but because of its silence. Because it shows how easily the truth can be buried when no one wants to see it. How a community can turn away, how the law can fail, how a woman can disappear in plain sight. The farmhouse is gone. The brothers are gone. Dorothea is gone, but the story remains, waiting in the archives, waiting to be found. And now you know it too.